Pneuma is the second song on the long-awaited fifth studio album by the American rock band Tool. It was produced by Tool as well as Joe Barresi and mastered by Bob Ludwig. Although not released as a single, the song has quickly become a fan favourite, amassing over 6 million views on YouTube since the album's release on August 30th, 2019. I had a few comments on my last Tool analysis video asking to analyse Pneuma, stating that it was the spiritual successor to Schism or Lateralis or various other Tool songs. While I do think there is some merit to this statement, I find it hard to pin down as a successor to any one particular Tool song. It incorporates so many familiar Tool elements and draws influence from all different areas of the Tool canon, resulting in an unmistakably Tool song. Wow, I said Tool a lot just then, didn't I? I will be examining these connections in more detail as we progress. While originating from Greek medical writings that referred to it as the breath of life, Pneuma takes on a more deeply spiritual meaning for the Stoics. In Stoic philosophy, the pneuma is the human soul, which itself is a fragment of the soul of the Almighty. It is also an active, generative principle that informs both the individual and the cosmos. It determines the path of all things, living or not, driving the wheel of time forward until the inevitable destruction of all things and nothing is left but pure pneuma. We will see many references to these themes in Maynard's lyrics as we take a closer look, but for now let's start at the beginning. Pneuma is nearly 12 minutes long and surprisingly sticks more or less to a traditional verse-chorus structure. It begins with an intro that foreshadows parts of an instrumental jam that happens later in the song. As the intro ends, the main riff of the song is established on the bass. This riff forms the foundation for both the verses and the choruses of the song. After a few verses and choruses, each followed by yet another riff, the song transitions into the aforementioned instrumental jam, which builds to a massive crescendo only for everything but the guitar to drop out. The guitar reintroduces the main riff of the song and is then joined by the rest of the band as it establishes a final heavy rock riff that leads nicely into a final chorus. That's the basic roadmap of the song. Let's take a closer look at each section. The intro is that of a lone guitar playing an ominous minor sounding riff that, as I mentioned, foreshadows a section later in the song. As I've said in my last Tool video, Tool are masters of motif. They will not create an idea without thoroughly exploring it to its fullest potential, and while it may not seem immediately connected to the verses and the choruses we hear as the song gets started proper, we will be hearing from this motif again. Tool does this as well in the song Lateralis from the album Lateralis. The guitar establishes a motif in the intro of the song which gives way to a seemingly unrelated riff that forms the basis for the chorus. You don't think much of it when you first hear the song, but as the song progresses, the motif is brought back and its connection to the song as a whole is made clear. This is exactly what happens in Pneuma, and as I've said before, is just good songwriting. It's all well and good to write interesting, complex riffs and ideas, but without the sense of cohesion that is brought about by developing and connecting those ideas to the song as a whole, you're left with nothing but a jumbled mess. The riff itself is played on a guitar in drop D tuning, a method for tuning the guitar which involves dropping the lower E string down a tone to D. A series of 4 chords are played. Even though not every note of each chord is present, we can infer from the notes in surrounding chords what they might be. The first chord is an open A power chord. Power chords are very common in rock music and refer to a chord that contains only the root and the fifth. The lack of a third makes the quality of the chord rather ambiguous, which isn't really an issue in a lot of rock music, which is more about heavy driving riffs fueled by lots of distortion than complex harmony. That being said, you can usually infer what its quality would be based on the key and the chords surrounding it. In this case, the riff and the song as a whole are very deeply grounded in a D minor tonality, and this chord is followed by an F major 7, implying that any Cs we find would be natural rather than sharp, making this an A minor chord. So the chord progression goes A minor to F major 7, then he drops the 7th of the F, E, down to a D, creating this great crunchy sounding F6 chord, and then finally a big open D5 with that low D string. The next thing you'll notice about this is how Adam Jones is playing the chords. He's not simply strumming each of the chords on the beat, he's doing a couple of different things to make this progression a little more interesting. Adam is creating what is known as a 4/3 polyrhythm. A 4/3 polyrhythm is exactly what it sounds like. In the space of 3 beats, 4 notes are played. It sounds like this. One of the first ways I learned how to hear this polyrhythm is to say, pass the peanut butter, which sounds kind of silly, but it works. Pass the peanut butter, pass the peanut butter, pass the peanut butter, pass the peanut butter. You get the idea. You will usually see it written like this, but unless you know what this means, you're not going to have much luck playing it. Sure, you can just try jamming 4 notes over 3 beats, but there's actually a way that you can work this out. If we take a full bar of 3/4 and fill it with 16th notes, we get this. Now, if we accent every 4th 16th note, we end up with 4 accented notes evenly spaced over a bar of 3/4, a 4/3 polyrhythm. So you can play just the accented notes and you're left with that polyrhythm. This can be used to very interesting effect to create rhythmic tension in your songs, or to even modulate the time of your song from one time signature to another. But hold on, Mike, I hear you saying, Adam isn't playing 3/4, he's playing in 4/4, and he's using 8th notes. Alright, chill out, I'm getting there. If we half the tempo of the song and adjust the notes so that we're using 8th and 16th notes rather than quarters and eighths, we end up with a riff that sounds exactly the same, but you'll notice fits perfectly into the mold of a 4/3 polyrhythm that I showed you earlier, with each chord taking up the space of 3 16th notes. So what Jones has essentially done is create a 4/3 polyrhythm over the space of 2 bars rather than just 1. If you imagine that the beat was on the half note rather than the quarter, you'll see the 4/3 polyrhythm created by 8th notes against it. Now we come to our first bit of motivic development. Having already established this motif, Jones proceeds to create a variation of it. The essence of the motif stays the same, and yet with a few minor changes, we have a completely new sound. The 4/3 polyrhythm persists, but a change is made to what I'll call the individual modules of the polyrhythm as a whole. Check it out. In the first motif, the modules were made up of a group of 1/8 note followed by a group of 2/8 notes, whereas the second motif flips that around, starting with 2/8 notes followed by 1/8 note. The overall feel of the polyrhythm stays the same, while the rhythm within the modules changes. It's a very subtle change, but to awesome effect. The other change that is made to distinguish this motif from the last is how the chords are voiced. Though they are essentially the same chords, they are played much higher on the guitar in much more open voicings, with an easily distinguishable melody on top. This is a stark contrast to the lower, crunchier voicings used in the original motif. Meanwhile, in yet another act of foreshadowing, the drums and, I'm gonna say, the bass? I'm not sure what it is, but it's being used in a percussive way, so it doesn't really matter. The bass and the drums play a distinctive rhythm against the guitar, and guess what it is? That's right, it's our old friend 4/3, epic. Last thing about the intro, and perhaps my favourite part, just because it's so random and doesn't really happen again, the guitar ends on a D major chord, while up until now everything has been in this darker, minor sounding tonality, admittedly never outright stating a D minor chord, but heavily implying it, and then BAM! D major, and then we get into the verse and we never hear from it again. Everything in this section to me is very reminiscent of South Asian music. The guitar has a very sitar-esque tone to it, especially on that last chord. The percussion reminds me a lot of the tabla, a South Asian percussion instrument. One of the things I love about the song is how it simmers. It really takes its time to develop and is perfectly okay with just grooving away, never fully reaching epic hardcore mode until towards the end of the instrumental jam. Maynard's voice in particular is very restrained for the whole song, and the thing that really kicks it into 12th gear is the band in the instrumental section. There's no epic, soaring rock vocals like this part from Schism, or this from Jambi, which I kinda miss, but it's just not that sort of song. Anyway, sidetrack. The guitar sustains the last chord of the intro and it swells as if to burst into a heavy riff, but instead the bass kicks in with the main riff of the song. Now, there are a couple of ways this riff can be interpreted. When I first figured it out, I thought it was like this. A bar of 5/8, followed by 11/8, then 12/8, and then a final bar of 5/8 again. At first glance, this works, but once the riff is heard in context with the rest of the band, it makes more sense to think about it like this. One bar of 14/8, followed by 12/8, and then a bar of 7/8. The thing that threw me off at first was this first note here. Since it's played first, I assumed it was the start of the riff, so I counted from here and laid out the rest of the riff accordingly. But because of how it falls into the groove of the song, how the accents fall, and the way the lyrics line up, it turns out it's actually a pickup note. A pickup note being a note that precedes the downbeat of and leads the ear into a bar. A good example of this is when Maynard sings Pneuma. The nu being the pickup to the downbeat where ma lands. The first hint we get that the first note being played on the bass in this riff is actually a pickup note is when the drums enter. Instead of starting on this note like the bass, Danny Carey enters here. He continues to accent this pickup and the downbeat throughout the subsequent repetitions of the riff, which is a big indicator that the bar starts here. The next big hint is at the beginning of the chorus. Everything comes back together at this point, emphasizing this note as the downbeat of the bar. Danny Carey does a drum fill that ends right here. Adam Jones's guitar starts doubling the bass riff, and Maynard's voice sings the title of the track, Pneuma, landing right on the beat. Now that we know where the downbeat is, the rest just falls into place. So, one bar of 14/8, one bar of 12/8, and one bar of 7/8. First, 14/8. Seems complicated, but it's essentially just the same as 12/8, but with 2 extra notes at the end. Let me explain. 12/8 is felt in groups of 3 eighth notes, the beats landing here. It's basically a bar of 4/4 with triplets. If you count 4/4 and clap triplets over top, this will sound and feel the same as a bar of 12/8. Now, 14/8 would be exactly the same, but with one set of 2 eighth notes right at the end, like this. This is a good way to start thinking about odd time signatures in groups of 2 or 3 eighth notes. You can make any odd time you like by combining eighth notes in this way. 7/8, 2, 2, and 3. 5/8, 2, and 3. 11/8, 3, 3, 3, and 2. Obviously, there are many different combinations of 2s and 3s that you could use, but starting to think of these times in this way is a good introduction to understanding and feeling these odd times. And you'll notice Tool groups notes in this way in Pneuma. The bass and the guitar are playing the same riff, and as you can see, it can be broken up into groups of 3 or 2. Try counting through like this. 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 3. Notice where the pulses fall, namely every time you say 1 or every time you need to bang your head. And the drums reinforce this perfectly, outlining the beats using bass and snare drum hits all in groups of 3 or 2. Like I said earlier, this cohesion and sense of unity is essential in a song like this where the time is so complex it runs the risk of sounding jumbled and messy. It's also fitting that in this song about being part of something larger than oneself, the individual parts of this band work together to create one greater whole. Pneuma. Once the guitar enters and starts doubling the bass, the band is in full swing and grooves along nicely for a few repetitions of the riff. Then something changes that throws off your now perfectly timed and educated headbangs. At first, everything seems more or less the same, the triplety 12/8 groove with notes in groups of 3 and the beats as before until we get to here. Let's count through and see if we can figure out how it's changed. A good way to start recognizing whether a bar is in an odd time or meter is to listen for these jumpy moments when the beat kind of skips. For example, at the end of this bar we hear that skipping feeling comes from the fact that an eighth note is missing from what would, in an even time, feel continuous and even.
All through here, the beat is established as regular and even in nice, tidy groups of 3/8 notes until we get to here and the skip happens. So let's count up the notes until this point and figure out what the time signature is. If you remember from before, we talked about 12/8 being 4 groups of 3/8 notes. Well, here we have 5 groups of 3/8 notes, so this is simply a bar of 15/8. Next, the skippy bar. The skip happens after this first quarter note, telling us there is a missing 8th note and therefore an odd meter has occurred. Now we just count the groups of 8th notes and bam! We've identified a bar of 5/8.
The next bar is 5/8 as well, but the beat is flipped around. In the first bar of 5/8, the band places emphasis on the first and third 8th notes, while in the second bar, the emphasis is on the first and fourth 8th notes. The same number of 8th notes, but 2 slightly different ways to feel them, either 1-2, 1-2-3, or 1-2-3, 1-2. Easy, right? Turns out this is how the chorus differs from the verses being repetitions of the main riff, while the chorus adds in this little variation. Harmony-wise, it's a lot easier to get your head around. As previously mentioned, we're deeply grounded in a D minor tonality, specifically D Aeolian. Aeolian being the 6th mode of the major scale, more commonly referred to as the relative minor. In this case, D Aeolian is the 6th mode of F major, giving us the notes D, E, F, G, A, B flat, and C. Let's take a look at what's going on harmonically through these 2 riffs. The first thing we notice is the droning D note that remains constant throughout this riff. What changes is the note on top, starting at an A, moving up to a B flat, back to A, then to G, back to A, then F, G, and finally E before it returns to A. The melody that is created adds tension to an otherwise homogeneous harmonic landscape, and I find this very reminiscent of Indian classical music. The minor 6 interval that is created by the D and the B flat is a dark twist on the common major 6 used in a lot of rock and roll music, and right off the bat sets a dark tone for the song, common to hard rock bands like Tool. The A and the G create these open-sounding perfect 4th and 5th intervals, while the E makes a clashy major 2nd. These all help to add to the ambiguous nature of the harmony. Very rarely during these sections is the 3rd ever played, just here, and with relatively few thirds, the tonality of the harmony remains very open, yet still rather dark and minor sounding. It just shows you that the tonality of a piece, or section of a piece, can be more subtly implied through context, i.e. the things that precede and follow it, the lyrics, the production, etc. Okay, so that was the intro. Whew, how much time we got left? Okay. The verse. At this point, Adam Jones introduces a new riff. The first time I heard this riff, I was instantly reminded of 2 other Tool songs. The main riff of The Pot and the climax section of the cover of No Quarter. Mainly because they're all riffs in a drop D tuning that revolve around this octave sound and are very rhythmically interesting. In my last video analyzing Schism, I stated that the first riff could be counted in 3/4. I received many comments saying that this was wrong and that I should have felt 1 bar of 5/8 and 1 bar of 7/8. While both are valid, my intention was to show an easier way for people to understand and feel this riff. The same can be done for this riff here. One difference is that as Pneuma progresses, we will hear the band outlining different interpretations at different points in the song, leaving no question as to how it should really be counted. Let's take a look. The riff occurs at 3 different stages throughout this section of the song, in the first and second verses, as well in an instrumental refrain before the second verse. The first time it happens, it's only being played by the guitar and it's very much at odds with the main riff of the song. While harmonically very simple, Jones's riff is rhythmically complex, implying different time signatures and creating some interesting polyrhythms that cross with the already established groove of the song, adding subtle tension to the verses. It's a fantastic example of motivic development and actually reminds me very much of this section of Schism. A A motif is established here and goes through 3 variations, here, here, and here, and we can analyze them the same way we did with the main riff. The first is a group of 3 notes and then 2, so it's implying 5/8. The first variation starts the same, but the second note is extended to the space of 3 eighth notes, essentially adding 2 eighth notes to the motif. So we have a group of 2, then 3, then 2 again, 7/8. The next variation is the same as the first, but it starts here in the bar of 14/8, so that the second note of the motif lands on the beat at the beginning of the 12/8 bar, making these 2 off the beat, giving a slightly different feel to the motif.
The final variation adds a third note to the first half and actually creates a 3/2 polyrhythm, more commonly known as quarter note triplets, before rounding out the bar with a little addition to the end of the motif.
So a group of 3, another 3, and 3 again, so 9/8. The second section of the overall riff, Jones plays a run up from the low D to a higher D. This is the part that reminds me of No Quarter. The second time we hear it is in the second verse. Jones plays the upper part of the riff an octave lower, giving it that signature dark, crunchy sound we hear in many other Tool songs. At this point, it's helpful to start feeling the riff in a different way, simply a bar of 12/8 repeated twice. This, again, creates a tension with the already established groove, but because of the heavier feel and prominence of the guitar in the mix, our ear is drawn towards it, giving an altogether different feel to this verse overall. Not only that, but Maynard's vocal line mirrors this change. The vocal line in the first verse looked like this. As you can see, it places emphasis on the downbeats of each bar, here and here, and outlines the final 7/8 here. In this second verse, however, the vocal line falls into step with the guitar riff. Maynard sings this phrase twice, which fits perfectly with the 12/8 feel. Another cool thing is that the drum groove, while remaining in the established time of the main riff, emphasizes certain parts of this new riff here and here. So, at this point, we have half the band playing the main riff of 14/8, 12/8, and 7/8, with the other half running counter to that with phrases being felt in 12/8. Not only that, but the drums are supporting both by emphasizing important beats with snare drums and hi-hats. The third iteration of this riff comes after the second verse. It's essentially a third verse but without vocals. The bass continues to play the main riff, but the drums switch to locking in with the guitar.
But instead of playing in the 12/8 like the last variation, they outline the motif with its 3 variations of 5/8, 7/8, and 9/8.
Pretty rad, right? This is the magic of Tool. They are so good at what they do. They can play riffs in very complex time signatures while feeling them in multiple different other times that cross over and juxtapose with each other. It's glorious. Let's talk about Maynard's vocal line. The first we hear of it is this kind of reverse echo that leads into the top of the verse. I really love this effect, and it gives a dreamy, mystical quality to the voice, which helps to reinforce the spiritual themes within the lyrics. We are spirit, bound to this flesh, but bound to reach out beyond this flesh, become Pneuma. We are will and wonder, bound to recall, remember. We are born of one breath, one word, we are all one spark. We are all part of one spirit, one being, bound to our physical bodies, but destined to return to the source, to Pneuma. I remember hearing this vocal effect for the first time on a track from one of my other favorite bands, Radiohead. Bloom, the opening track on their 2011 album, The King of Limbs, is another song filled with rhythmic complexity, with a reasonably simple harmonic and melodic structure awash in a soundscape of synthesizers and effects. In the last verse of the song, each vocal line is preceded by an echo of itself, almost as if it's a memory coming back to the listener. The vocal line itself is very sparse and harmonically simple, choosing to stick to the fifth and a few notes around it, but fits perfectly atop the already rhythmically complex groundwork laid by the band. As I mentioned before, the vocal line of the second verse changes to lock in with the guitar. It's also doubled by this fantastic low voice that adds huge depth to the line and the overall heaviness of the second verse. As the first chorus ends, the guitar swells much like it did in the intro, but this time, instead of faking out to the main riff again, it leads the band right where we expect it to, into a huge driving rock riff. This section serves as the second big memorable riff of the song and as a place for Danny Carey to show off his impressive chops on the drums. The riff looks like this, echoing a similar harmony to the chords in the intro, F major and D minor, as well as that 4/3 polyrhythm. The riff is repeated many times as Carey progressively ramps up the intensity. Next comes the instrumental jam. This is one of my favorite parts of the song. It's an epic 4-minute instrumental tying in motifs from the intro to the main motif of the song as it slowly builds to a thundering crescendo that concludes in some of the most epic hard rock riffs yet. Though it can be difficult to spot due to the polyrhythmic nature of each of the instrument's parts, the whole section is actually in 4/4. The basic roadmap goes like this. Coming out of the post-chorus riff, the guitar sustains a huge power chord that continues to ebb and flow as it feeds back and phases in and out with itself. The drums enter with an interesting rhythm on the toms and snare rim, followed by the bass that plays a familiar motif from the intro of the song. I told you it'd be back. Everything slowly builds and the intensity ramps up as the drums establish a more solid 4-to-the-floor groove and the guitar edges in to mirror the bass motif. The drums continue to add more complexity to its driving 16th note groove as the guitar explores some motifs that are new but nonetheless related to the original intro motif. As we build towards the climax of the song, everything cranks up one more gear. The guitar returns to the intro motif, playing huge crunchy power chords. The drums mirror the rhythm of the guitar and bass with huge thundering whacks of the low toms and bass drum, and the bass, which up until this point remained constant and solid, has moved to a driving 16th note rhythm. The final push comes as the guitar adds more harmonic complexity with high, crunchy chords and the drums crash out that 4/3 rhythm on the cymbals. Since this section is very much a jam section that has much more of an improvisational feel to it than the more structured verses and choruses, I don't think I need to go over every second of it with a fine-tooth comb, but there are a few things I would like to highlight. The first is this cool rhythm played on the drums at the beginning. Remember back in the intro when I said this? Tool are masters of motif. They will not create an idea without thoroughly exploring it to its fullest potential. Yeah, this is that same rhythm that was teased in the intro. This rhythm is very closely related to the 4/3 polyrhythm. They are exploring this rhythm in as many ways as they possibly can. Because there is no established beat at this point, it's not immediately obvious what this rhythm is, but once the bass and the drums enter, it becomes clear. Here's what it looks like. It's 2 16th notes followed by a 16th note rest, so a group of 3 16th notes repeated. Because of the uneven nature of this pattern, it will not land back on beat 1 until it has been played through 3 bars, and it also creates that feeling of the 4/3 polyrhythm, which is emphasized even more when Carey adds in the cross stick. And again, without the established beat, this actually sounds more like triplets, but once the bass enters, it's clear that this is a 16th note pattern. This is actually a really cool way of practicing scales, playing 16th notes in groups of 3 like this, or triplets in groups of 4, or 5, or 7. It just adds a bit of rhythmic interest to your scales. The second thing is the underpinning harmony of this section provided by the bass. The bass line, excusing a few little fills, stays constant throughout this whole section, while the rest of the band changes and evolve around it. The drums adding more and more rhythmic complexity and the guitar exploring different areas of harmonic interest by first mirroring the bass, then introducing new motifs that expand and complement the original. So, what's the bass actually doing, Michael? Get on with it! Okay. The bass is playing A, F, and then D in groups of 3 8th notes. Where have I seen that before? It's the intro motif! As if I didn't already know. Tool established a motif in the intro of the song only to bring it back as the basis for this entire instrumental section and give it the development it deserves before connecting it back to the main motif of the song. So, the bass and guitar play this motif together. It simmers away nicely for a few repetitions and then the guitar switches, introducing a motif that is new but familiar. It looks like this. The interesting thing about it is that it is very much emphasizing extensions or color tones of the chords rather than the basic chord tones, which you will remember happened in the intro as well. As we've established, the chords in this section are A minor, F major 7, and D minor. The notes that make up each of these chords are A, C, and E, F, A, C, and E, and D, F, and A. You'll notice that they all share quite a few similar notes, which can be helpful to know when you're improvising. If you're playing an F major 7 chord, play an A minor triad and you'll be outlining all of those chord tones. Playing a D minor chord, play an F major 7 arpeggio and you'll be outlining chord tones as well as adding in a ninth. The motif itself is created from an A minor pentatonic scale, a 5-note scale comprised of the notes A, C, D, E, and G. And the notes that really stick out here are this E and this G and E. The E being the major 7 of the F major chord, and the G and E being the 11th and 9th of the D minor chord. You'll notice that when the guitar played this in the intro, it outlined these very same notes, albeit in a slightly different place. Nevertheless, the connection between this new motif and the originals from the intro is unmistakable, once again establishing this as part of a cohesive whole rather than just another random idea. This is also another great idea for improvisation. If you're improvising in a D minor tonality but want to add some more variation and harmonic interest, try using an A minor pentatonic scale. You'll find this a lot in jazz music, especially modal jazz, a style of jazz that revolves around long stretches of a single chord or tonal center, popularized by the late great Miles Davis on his album Kinda Blue. So some really interesting color tones that make for a much more vibrant harmony that was, until now, grounded in a much darker place. This works really well with the building energy of the piece at this point. The guitar switches again to a new but familiar motif. It mirrors the rhythmic shape of the original intro motif and even many of the same notes, but manages to remain fresh. Whereas the original has this descending part, the new motif sticks to the same note while outlining many of the same notes above that, very present in the original motif, and adding this little run at the end. Just more great motivic development. Finally, the guitar jumps back to huge power chords as the drums and bass kick into 12th gear. The bass continues what it was doing, but instead of holding out the notes as it did before, it turns the motif into a driving 16th note line. The final cherry on this motivic cake comes when the guitar switches back to the higher voiced chords that illustrate those interesting color tones from before, and the drums really pound home those 4/3 rhythms with big cymbal crashes. Just before we move on, I want to take a quick look back at all the different variations of that original motif that the band has gone through. The motif was established here in the intro on the guitar. Its first variation came here, and then it is dropped until the instrumental jam, where it's brought back, slightly varied on the bass. The guitar brings it back proper here, then takes it through 4 more variations. That's 6 variations of that initial motif, not counting all the interesting stuff done with the 4/3 idea, and it's only one of the many motifs in the song. Great songwriting. Right, we're just about at the home stretch. The return to the main motif of the song comes with a huge thud of the bass drum. The guitar, exhibiting those crisp, biting tones synonymous with Adam Jones's sound, blast the main motif back into full focus. The connection between these two sections is so smooth, you barely even notice that it happened. It all happens in the sneaky little dropped beat right here that sets up the pickup note and brings us back to this iconic main riff. Whereas before, the main riff was relaxed and dreamy, echoing the spiritual themes of the lyrics.
It's now edgy, agitated, and, dare I say, jolly well hardcore, chaps.
This comes from a combination of the riff punctuating the relentless low chugging of the D string and Jones's guitar tone. So we're back at the main riff, but Tool has one more surprise up its sleeve, throwing a curveball in the form of one final badass riff. It looks like this. The riff can be broken down into 2 different motifs with some variation thrown in for good measure. The main motif looks like this. It's made up of 5 eighth notes starting on a D power chord, followed by 2 low Ds and ending with a C power chord sliding back up to the D. The second motif is in 7/8 and looks like this.
With all this in mind, we can see that the band is simply alternating between these two motifs.
The main motif is repeated 3 times, here, here, and here, with this slight addition on the first time. The second motif actually acts as the pickup to this section here and comes back after the 3 repetitions of the main motif, leading into this final bar of 9/8. Throughout the section, the bass is mirroring the guitar, and once again the drums outline the beats with huge hits on the bass and snare drums. As the section is repeated, Danny Carey adds in more and more complex fills that help to complement the groove and ramp up the intensity as they build towards the final chorus. And while he's playing some very fast, complicated rhythms, he never loses sight of the underlying pulse of the riff. Listen to this last repetition of the section. Huge, complex fills that remain grounded in the pulse of the riff. But one of my favorite fills is this one. Carey plays 3 flams on the snare drum that nicely fit with this part of the riff, but they also feel like a little reply to this part. Have a listen. It's just such a cool little touch that adds so much. And finally, we come crashing back into a colossal, thundering final chorus, bolstered by the intensity that has been building over the sections that preceded it. The final words sung by Maynard, perhaps the most apt given what we have just witnessed. Eyes full of wonder. The song concludes with a final post-chorus riff, and with somewhat an oddity. We don't often hear Adam Jones soloing in the classic rock sense of the word, but here we have just that, and it's great. From start to finish, Pneuma takes us on a journey, both musically and spiritually. It tells us that we are part of something more than just ourselves, that rather than a collection of individuals, we are all one. And rather than just a collection of instruments playing a collection of riffs, Pneuma is all one.
Hi guys, thanks for watching. This one took me a very long time, as many of you are aware, and the whole global pandemic thing didn't make it any easier. But I really enjoyed deep diving into some of Tool's new material. If you enjoyed it as much as I did, then please share this video with your friends or anyone who might be interested in some musical analysis. I have some ideas for future videos, but if you have a song in mind that you'd like me to take a look at, then please drop me a comment below, and if you want to see more content like this, then like and subscribe. Finally, if you want to support my work, then pop over to my Patreon page, or just buy me a coffee with Ko-fi. Stay safe and healthy, wash your hands, and I'll catch you next time.